Hi everyone, this is going to be probably part of a short series of videos where we cover a slightly different take on video game graphics and specifically, but not solely, 2D pixel art. And that is how the core principles of fine art, especially 2D art like painting and drawing, how they are really important core principles to understand even if you never plan on doing an actual painting or even drawing in your life. If you're going to be doing purely digital and purely pixel art, you'll still be a stronger artist and be able to communicate better as a graphic artist if you understand these core principles. And as always, Corey is here with me. Say hi, Corey.
Hey, how's it going?
All right, so one of the things that I wanted to get into right away is just this concept of what it is to be a 2D artist in the tradition of fine art. The whole point was to use some kind of 2D media, whether it be graphite or charcoal or paints. The whole idea was to create the illusion on a 2D surface that would be able to create the illusion of something, like a physical space, another person, an object, or all of the above, and then communicate something to the viewer. And especially that aspect of communication is probably the most important skill to build as a 2D video game artist, or in fact 3D artist as well. So going back to this concept of creating an illusion, it's certainly part of the communication, but this idea of creating this immersive situation, creating an atmosphere, creating an environment, creating something that someone will see and that they will immediately recognize and relate to in some way. So some of the most obvious illusions that you create on a 2D surface is you create the illusion of depth. You create the illusion of distance in a landscape, such as this is one of my oil paintings on the screen here. And so you use many tricks, you apply knowledge to the way you control the color, the light, and the contrast to create the illusion that this 2D surface goes back for anything from feet or yards or meters to miles. And so I do want to get into the specifics of that a little bit, and then we can get back to the more general conversation. So probably the most important when you're working in color, which most visual artists are going to be working in, one of the core elements of creating the illusion of depth, especially when you're doing a landscape, something that really goes back for miles, so you have a sky, you have air. One of the most important aspects that people can learn is that the sky, the sort of general sky color is the most important thing to keep in mind to help you create that illusion of depth. And the easiest way to understand that is during the daytime when the sky is usually going to be some shade of blue. The trick is this simple. If you're a fine art painter and you can use the same trick in a digital program like Photoshop or something, the stuff that's up close to you is going to be what we'll kind of consider the real color of the object. So trees are going to be very strong greens with dark contrast going almost to a black or a very dark green for the darkest leaves in shadow, going to a lighter yellower green where the sun is really hitting them. And then so you've got really sharp detail, really sharp contrast, and very vivid colors. So those are all of and of course things are bigger when they're closer to you. So these are all the clues on a 2D surface that something is close to you. You recognize the kind of real color of the objects, you see the fine detail, it's not blurry. As things move... Yep, go ahead, Corey. Yep.
Sorry.
No, please do jump in.
Speaking to what you said about, scale of things, if you're doing like a distance, like you've got here in the painting,
yep.
you have those houses back there,
exactly.
Which, based on their shapes, people are gonna read those as houses.
Exactly.
But you've got the building in the foreground,
right,
to give, they're in the distance because you know how big real houses are, but since you've got this one in the foreground, you get the sense of actual distance there.
Exactly.
Two things related, far apart from each other.
Right.
That's important. If you can't tell what the thing in the foreground is,
right,
if it's not obvious, then you're going to lose a little bit of that sense of scale. So,
right. exactly right. And you could tell by the way this thing looks, that it's much more of a kind of farm shack used to store something like hay or something like that. So it's
Right.
one story and relatively small, but you could see back here by the size of the windows that some of these houses, especially this one here, is like 2-story or two, and then like an attic area. You could see there's probably like a drive-in garage under this house here or something. So, like Corey was mentioning, these are things you recognize, that every human being is going to recognize as a dwelling for humans, and since it's only about an inch on the canvas, you know that's far away. But also, it's more diffused, it's not in contrast, its colors are not bright. You can't see detail. These are the other clues to the fact that it's far away in the distance. And then another important element to creating the illusion of depth on a 2D surface is the concept of overlapping. This is a critical cue to the viewer that you've got layers of distance. You've got the sky. The sky is being overlapped at its base by these really far away hills of trees. And then you've got the closer up trees, which you can see a little more detail. The darks are a little darker. The colors are a little more close to the real colors that you see up in the foreground. You're starting to be able to see individual details, the shapes of the branch patterns, the trunks. All of this is starting to become visible, and you'll notice that layer is overlapping the previous layer that's farther away. And then you've got the hills and the houses, and then the little trees in the mid-ground. They overlap the houses. All of this is helping establish a sense of depth. The more things overlap each other as it comes forward into the foreground, the better your illusion of depth. And to get into going back to the sky, the point of the sky color, look how simple this is. So many beginner artists and a lot of people that are well into going into years of sort of hobbyist landscape painters, they can go years struggling with this concept of what do I do to the colors of objects and to their value, which is how light and dark, to get the sense of depth. And the trick is literally this simple. All you have to do is literally create a mix. So if we grab sort of a medium color in the clouds and then the base color of the sky, and you mix that color, and if this were real paint, if you kept it to the side in a jar or on your palette, or in digital art, if you just made a color swatch of that color, that's like a mix of your sky colors, like an average.
Right.
And then all you do is the farther away you want something to be. So let's say you're going to make a tree, right? You start with the actual base color of the tree, which would be a rich dark green. You take that color and you just mix in more and more of the sky color. And the more you mix in, the farther back, that's giving you the exact color that the tree would be, the farther back it is by mixing in more and more of the sky color. And if you think about it, that's exactly what is happening. We think of the sky as transparent, but there's bajillions, to use a scientific word, there's bajillions of tiny particles of gas and dust and all these other things in that air that's refracting and reflecting light. And this is why, the sky in general is blue. You've got these things that are overall absorbing and refracting the other color frequencies other than blue more so. And it's reflecting or filtering blue light to you. That's the general idea. So we think of air as clear because in a general distance that we're used to experiencing to look at things that are close to us, our eyes aren't going to perceive that it's being really, really slightly diffused by these little particles bouncing the light in different directions or filtering out different frequencies of color. But it is happening, right? It's just, so many tiny parts per billion or something, it's very subtle. But when you go back yards or miles, now there's an accumulative effect because you could just consider it like, that translucent, really thin sheets of rice paper or vellum that are semi-transparent? Mm-hmm. So picture each sheet of vellum was tinted that sky color, and it was almost transparent, but not quite. So just think of it as the further back you go, there's another sheet of that vellum, and another sheet of that vellum, And I hope everyone knows what vellum. Vellum is just a fancy artist paper that's like a really high quality tracing paper. Just a very smooth. Most tracing papers are made with like really, it's mostly glue and recycled fiber and stuff like that. So in general, if you hold a sheet of tracing paper up to a light or a window, it'll look very blotchy, whereas a sheet of vellum is going to look very even and smooth if you put it on a light box or something like that. But anyway, that's more technical than we need to be about paper. But the point is, so literally the further back you go, there's just sort of this other, yet you keep adding these layers of this translucent sky color. So that is the simple way that you get that depth. And keep in mind, one really important thing is that when you are an artist, your goal is not to sort of robotically and mechanically copy exactly what you see. This is a trap that a lot of people can fall into that want to do representational, realistic looking art. When you're learning, of course, you want to copy photos, you want to copy from live models and live objects, which is much better than using photos for many reasons, which hopefully we'll get into either in this video or the next one in this series. So just to mention a specific example I experienced recently, I belong to several Facebook groups of artists and aspiring artists and things like that. And there are a lot of beginner artists that will, of course, like I was saying, that they want to learn from photos to make sure they're doing things realistically, but you can really fall into a trap of just having this attitude, well, I made it look like the photo, so obviously I'm doing it correctly. Or then even if a pro artist, not that this happened to me, I'm not being defensive, that they took my feedback very well, but a beginner artist could fall into that trap of going, well, obviously this guy doesn't know what they're talking about because I'm looking at the photo and it looks just like the photo. And in the case of a particular person that was looking for feedback, she was using a photo reference. It was a single image taken from a movie. And what they obviously did in that movie, just a sort of directorial cinematography type situation, what they did was the actual camera was far away to get an entire battle scene.
Right.
And then during a certain sequence, they wanted to zoom in for more drama. And it was probably a very high-res modern digital camera and stuff like that. So they could do this without it getting all blurry or anything. But the problem is, there's this thing called, what is it called? There's this depth of field, okay? And so the problem is, when you're taking a photo or video recording something that's very far away, what's going to happen is foreshortening has far less of an effect. So if someone is standing right near you, you can see with this camera, the camera is acting like the human eye in this way. When I do my cliched Italian heritage hand waving all the time when I talk, my hands can get very close to the camera. And look, like my one finger is way bigger than my entire head. And obviously that's not the case. As I pull back here, you can see that my hand, and this is a good rule of canon for human proportions, by the way, the face from the hairline, if you have one, I sadly don't have a hairline anymore, to the bottom of the palm, or I should say the chin to the hairline, is typically the same height as the human hand. So a person's face is the same size as their open hand in general. But anyway, that was a digression. So where was I going? Remind me, Corey, before I digressed into the canon thing. Do you remember?
You were talking about depth of field.
Oh, yes. Okay. Yep. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I remember when you were talking about this particular thing with me, and the idea was, the pose of this character was he had his hand kind of out.
Right, for sure.
In front of him.
Exactly.
But the problem was the hand looked too small in the drawing.
Right.
Because that depth of field wasn't there because of the illusion of the kind of the flattening of the depth. Exactly.
So this is something that would look perfectly normal. If I walked really far away from the camera, which I can't do because there's a wall there, and held out my hand would always look pretty much the exact right size as if it were right near my face relative to the rest of my body. Even though I was sticking it way out in front of me like this, because I'm so far away, you don't get that same depth of field effect.
Right.
But, so the problem with this cinematic shot in a movie is the director said in the editing process, hey, for this part of this fight, let's zoom in on this famous actor with his shirt off and stuff like that, and this action going on. It'll be a nice dramatic scene, good eye candy for the fans that like this actor and, you know, his physical appeal and all that stuff. So they made that choice, and no one is going to question it in a moving video sequence in a AAA movie title, because it's photographic, right? They're not going to notice this perspective issue. Whereas once you're going to a 2D image, now you've got this single image frozen in time. You no longer have this extra sensory data of the movement of the light and shadow to help compensate for this problem. There's this actual problem, this miscommunication that's happening, that's going to be far less of a big deal. So the miscommunication is they zoomed in on this footage, which is telling your brain, it's telling your eyes, this is all happening close to you as the viewer. If that were true, you would have this extreme foreshortening, but that was completely gone. So if you look at the image just as a single image, right, without all the other sensory data compensating and distracting you, it's just going to look like this person is malformed, unfortunately, and has a tiny arm and hand, right? Because, like, it just looked really weird. But that's something that most young artists, they're going to go, well, I copied the photo, that's exactly how the photo looks, so you don't know what you're talking about. You're telling me to fix this or that, but you're wrong because the photo looks exactly like what I drew. There can be so many things in a photo, and on top of that now, most of the photos we see, especially from mainstream media sources, are heavily edited to begin with. So, you know what I mean? So it's very dangerous to purely rely on photos. It is much better to, as much as possible when you're learning, when you're doing exercises, to go to live model drawing sessions to learn anatomy, because then there will always be the natural human perspective based on how close something is. You'll get used to the exact right amount of foreshortening, which is that effect of things, body parts that are closer to the viewer getting bigger, this natural distortion that's supposed to happen that fills you in on how big something is and how close or how far it is. And to sort of segue back to a previous topic, going to this idea of depth, and so we covered how you get the exact right color to push something back into the distance. And I did mention briefly that things in the distance, they're more blurry and you can see less detail. But let me just cover that in a little more specific detail for people. So in general, especially on a medium daytime scene, your lightest highlights, unless the sun is further back and there's sunlight really directly hitting something where you can get that really bright highlight, in general, the lights aren't going to be quite as extreme because they're being mixed into this medium blue sky color. Mm-hmm. And the same thing with the darks. Even something in dark shadow, the further back you go, it's all getting diffused by all these little billions of particles of stuff that's refracting. So you can see you have these windows here. You've got some pretty dark colors on what would be very dark shingling on these roofs. But again, you'll see nothing ever approaches pure black back there. And that's just the important concept. It's all being diffused. So not only is it a little blurry around the edges, you're not using and also saturation, right? So any color, no matter how vivid, you'll know this with painting experience, the more you sort of mix in a whitish color, the more chalky and sort of pastel-y and muted the colors get, if that makes sense. Right, so you could picture yourself mixing colors, and you start with a really vivid pure red or green or whatever. If you just start slowly mixing in white, the color's not only going to get lighter, but it's going to become less and less and less saturated. It's going to become more and more like a chalky white kind of effect. And that's also very true if you've got a blue tint in it as well. Any warm color is going to become also cooler as it goes into the distance, and there's more of this blue sky mixed into it. So there's the every kind of contrast is reduced the farther back you go because it's getting more and more diffused. So you have the saturation of color is less contrasty because each color is less contrasted, and all colors become closer and closer to that blue sky color as you go back. Okay? So, and you can see here that the trees really far back, they're getting very close to this just blue sky color, just a little darker, just a little grayer. And then as they get closer and closer, you start to see the real colors come through until you're finally so close that there's so few of these particles in between you and the object that you see what any human brain is going to consider the true color of that object.
Right.
But again, so, and then you've got the contrast of texture. I don't remember if I hit on this point yet. But so, yeah, I don't think I did yet. So there's three kinds of contrast, just to reiterate if I did already say this. There's contrast of light and dark, which is value. There's contrast of color, which would also include saturation. So you're going to contrast your reddish colors from your greens. And obviously, if you show complementary colors, which are opposite colors on the color wheel, they are going to offer the strongest contrast. So if you want something to look really, really red, then you put it near something really, really green. And that's going to emphasize both colors and therefore make your red look as red as possible. And then, so that's your contrast of color. And then your final contrast is contrast of texture. So if you're designing something, the more of these contrasts that you play with, the more interesting your image can be. So, and this is talking purely for visual representation of real things. There's other kinds of contrast that we'll get into in a moment that are more sort of emotional or storytelling based. But so the core visual aspects of contrast are what I'm mentioning now, and the final one is texture. So having something really smooth against something really rough, having something that looks like a soft fabric or a pillow or a piece of cotton or a feather, texture near a stone or a steel texture, that those are two things that look very visually different, but it also conveys the psychology. Everyone is used to those surfaces, so in their brain it's creating a sensory contrast that is beyond the visual. They can sort of tactily feel the hardness of the stone and stuff like that by seeing it. Like every human mind there's that really cool, and my apologies to anyone that has this mental, I forget what it's called. It's really interesting. It'll come to me in a second. Do you know what I'm getting at? There's a thing where people will smell colors, or numbers will represent a color to them. There's a specific word for this.
Yeah, I can't remember the specific.
It's driving me nuts. I'm sure it's driving all the viewers nuts too. But it'll come to me later on, and I'll go, no, it shouted out in the middle of another topic. But so there's synesthesia. There we go. It came to me finally. So synesthesia. We all have this almost kind of synesthesia where when we see something, if we recognize that thing, it might strongly recall if we're looking at a photograph of a specific meal that we've enjoyed many times, we might begin to salivate. We might really strongly remember the flavor and things like that. And it's the same thing if you see something soft, if you see cool water being represented, for most people it's going to give them a sense of coolness and calm and stuff like that, unless they almost drown to death at one point, which seeing an image of deep blue water might evoke a different reaction to some people. But you know what I mean. It's
right.
Our eyes are going to communicate to the brain, which is going to start this chain reaction in different parts of our brain that are going to create the sensory data. It's all part of the communication, and that's one of the core points I wanted to bring up in this video. And I know I'm sort of bouncing all over the place, everyone. I apologize for that. But I think you'll see all of these topics go together, which makes it really hard to stay on topic if you've not scripted a very strict guideline of what topic to cover next. But
right, and it's important to remember, too, this idea of sort of attaching emotions to recognizable things, or even colors and textures. Right. It's yes, a lot of this can be very personal to some people,
Right.
but there are lots of these things that are highly universal.
Exactly.
That if you learn them, you're going to be not only a better artist, but just
Right.
a better communicator with what you're trying to convey through your art. So
Right. So even when different schools of art became extremely abstracted, the best of those artists with the most merit were the ones that started breaking the rules, but learned the rules first, so they knew why they were breaking those rules and what the effect of those rule breaks would make. And some of those core things that transcend any representational art is how different visual stimuli affect people in general and overwhelmingly. The overwhelming majority of people, because, we evolved into this situation as animals that were part of the food chain, red is an inherently extremely attention-getting color, right?
right.
It inherently creates a sense of anxiety of one form or fashion. It's an alerting. It's not necessarily alarming, but let's face it, in nature, most of the time, if you're seeing a bright red, it very likely could represent danger, harm, or food. So, all very, very important stuff for survival. And this is, of course, why different bugs and creatures and animals evolved to display certain colors, some of them being red as a sort of warning color, especially the really vivid warm colors became this evolved instinctual, like cross-species communication language for poison, for toxicity, right? So many plants and frogs and insects that were toxic, that had venom, they evolved to have these displays. And then non-toxic, non-venomous species later evolved to mimic those colors to sort of pretend that they were also dangerous and stuff like that. But anyway, the point is, stronger contrasts, really sharp contrast, more vivid warm colors, very sharp contrast in texture. If you have rigid, angular shapes sort of piercing each other, so if you have light or dark shapes kind of strongly contrasting with a background, all of these things are going to be sort of high anxiety kind of communications. So if you want something to be calm and relaxing to the overwhelming majority of people, you're going to be doing a lot of smooth blending. You're not going to have a lot of sharp contrasts anywhere. You're going to tend to use more cool colors. All of these things are just this built-in language of color and contrast and value and texture that just work overwhelmingly nearly across the board to any other human being across cultures and time periods. And so knowing these sorts of things can really help a more abstract artist still have communicative merit in their art. Because if they don't understand these things and they're just doing what they feel like on the canvas, then if the whole point, by definition, traditionally, of art is to communicate, to have a feeling or idea or concept, and to undergo this mechanical creation of an object or 2D image to evoke that same idea or feeling in other people, if you don't know these rules, if you don't know how communication works, and you're just doing what you feel like on the canvas, you might look at it and you might have all these memories of what you were thinking while you're doing that, but you're failing at communicating with other people. You're failing at evoking what you wanted to evoke in your art, and therefore it's really not art, or it's a failed attempt at art because you didn't have the knowledge necessary to communicate. It's the same thing where, let's say you're suddenly stranded as a foreigner in a land where people are speaking a completely different language that you've never experienced, and you're yelling and screaming in your language that you think they should perfectly understand, and you're failing at communicating because you don't know the laws of the language that they understand, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and for a sort of visual reference for what you're kind of getting at with all of this, is like, you take something like Lord of the Rings, you have the Shire, right, which is the beginning, the nice, peaceful area, but right, it's not just the color. It's the everything is rounded, everything
exactly.
is smooth,
Including the homes.
Including the homes. They
Right.
have the round doors, everything, rounded shapes. They're pleasant to us. They represent softness and
Right.
they ease our minds.
Right.
But then you go to Mordor, and not only is it the most harsh environment ever, with it being
Right.
sort of a lava volcano thing, but everything is a triangle. Everything is a sharp,
pointy, hard. Right? So you've got these. Suddenly, everything's warm colors. You've got these dark reddish, jagged stones. You've got this sense of a kind of volcanic activity. Everything is harsh contrast. Textures that everyone recognizes as hard and jagged and sharp and dangerous. That's exactly right. And your point just reminded me, and this is going into that thing I hinted at, these other kinds of contrasts. And I never thought of this before, but this is such a cool thing. So when they were showing the Shire, it was purely from the point of view of hobbits, which was brilliant, right? So they're communicating this calmness and this serenity, and everything's the same and everything's smoothed over. And so what was interesting is this could have been made to feel, from an outsider's point of view, while it's lovely, as a little bit stifling or claustrophobic. And the author, I remember, Tolkien, in his way, he really made it a point over and over again that the hobbits were extremely, what's the word? That there was a sort of cultural rule for everything, right?
Right.
No one ever left the Shire, and everyone knew everyone's family name going back a billion generations, and, anyone that even stepped outside of the Shire ever was kind of suddenly seen as like a weirdo. You know what I mean?
Yep.
So all of that, but first they portray this sort of, it's from the point of view of the hobbits. And if you look at a hobbit home, if it's described as a human, it's small, it's a hole in the ground, it's all these things that can sound claustrophobic. But when you see it from the point of view, as they show you, from the hobbits, they are beautiful, they are open, like gorgeous, elegant woodwork, big dome ceilings. Right. It's the opposite of claustrophobic. But the brilliance is, when they finally bring a human or humanoid, he's a wizard. I don't think wizards are technically humans in The Hobbit. Right. But when a human-shaped, a human-sized character, Gandalf, goes into one of these Hobbit homes, there's a great scene of him bumping his head. And it's suddenly, you see the Shire from this, as the story evolves, a big part of the story was these rare hobbits breaking away from this kind of very tight-knit, structured little mini world, this bubble that they all wanted to stay in, and they wanted to not deal with the outside world. So you had this really interesting sort of transformation. Suddenly you're seeing the other side from another perspective of not only the Shire itself and the attitude of the hobbits, but you're seeing the perspective from someone that, a human-sized wizard that has already traveled the whole world and stuff like that. And this home, while very nice and beautiful and quaint, was suddenly a very constricting, tiny thing, which was a direct visual in sensorial because he bumped his head. All of these things are a brilliant metaphor for this other aspect of Hobbit culture and the Shire itself and the homes themselves. Like a bird in a gilded cage, so to speak. And it's just brilliant storytelling. And these are the sort of things that visual artists, and especially I would say game artists, it has never been more important to communicate in more concrete ways as a 2D visual artist than with video games. Because the player has to physically, or quote-unquote physically interact with everything they're seeing. Never before has communication been so critical, because the character in the game is literally going to live or die or succeed or fail based on how clearly what is happening and what is there and what can be interacted with and what cannot be interacted with, how clearly that's communicated with them.
Right, and this speaks also to sort of the style of your game, right, in terms of the art. I see a lot of people, and this goes pretty far back even to plenty of old retro games too, right, where people they want to establish an art style, like maybe they'll make like a couple of environments, right? And so maybe it looks like this very scene, right? They've got a nice open green landscape. Everything's bright and colorful and warm and nice. And then to keep the style consistent, they might make the mistake of keeping the same sort of color scheme and mood that you invoke from those colors and shapes and everything throughout the entire game.
Right, exactly.
And it's important to remember sometimes you've got to break that style a little bit or deviate with your shapes, with your colors, as you go along, so that you can establish different moods at different times.
Exactly. So
part of the game, and this is especially good for if you're doing some sort of storytelling, But it also is
your reference
for any environment you make.
Your reference to the Lord of the Rings was perfect for this point.
Right.
Imagine how bizarre and how much less interesting the movie would be if the whole world, including Mordor, looked like the Shire.
Exactly.
So it's really, really important to understand how critical contrast is in every way, in a single image, but also in your entire story arc or the entire world that you're creating visually. Sometimes you want to break the visual rules that you've already established for the specific unnerving effect, or maybe your game will start in a place that looks like Mordor, and toward the end of the game, or at the ending of the game, the world or a part of it, or the place the player successfully escapes to, will suddenly look like the Shire. And imagine suddenly like oh my goodness, thank goodness now I've earned my way to this much more peaceful, calm place. I can live So these kind of contrasts are critical. So it can be a very easy mistake, and you're going to fall into this trap a lot more frequently if you're a single artist working on their own indie project and you don't have sort of an art director or someone to really manage in big projects, for weeks or months before the projects start, one or more concept artists will work all day, every day for this long span of time. And they'll just be throwing hundreds and hundreds of concept arts of environments, of objects, of characters, costume design, throwing them at an art director or game director. It's just sort of machine gunning all of these different styles at one person who needs to have a cohesive vision or needs to be able to arrive at a cohesive vision without stifling the range of communication. So that's the core thing. If everyone goes, starts with the Shire and then goes, okay, we've locked in our visual style, now they're hyper limited to what they can convey and the contrast that they can evoke visually and emotionally, which is a very bad thing. But a knowledgeable and experienced art director or game director in general, they're going to know this concept and they're going to say, okay, the pastel-y blue colors and stuff like that, that is not one of the concrete style guide rules, right? That's for this environment. But there can be other guides and rules. There can be a general rule. For example, you could have the creator or the art director could have this vision that everything should be based on insect anatomy. This is just completely like out of left field, out of my head, right? But this general rule, I mean, there's an immense range of visual colors and textures and contrast and moods and everything that can come from this. You've got everything from ladybugs, which are just this incredibly innocuous, harmless, cute thing, rounded, these cute little dots on this solid color. You don't have these jagged things. You don't have any of this other stuff that the kind of insects that make the average person go, oh my God, get it away from me, kill it.
Yeah, like you have like a mantis.
Exactly.
Contrasted to that, or
Right.
There's a million ways.
Right. A dragonfly is a great example. Like, I think they're beautiful and they're awesome looking, but it's way more intimidating. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, it's kind of in the range, like, let's say you did that with cats. You have everything from an adorable little fluff ball kitten to a lion. You know what I mean?
Yep.
Or a saber tooth. So those are the kind of things. Like, we want mostly these kind of shapes. We're going to handle lighting in a certain way in general. But all of these rules that are created, a good art director will know when to break even what was a concrete rule up to that point, maybe specifically because breaking that rule is going to be a really big thing. My favorite movie by far of that I'll always mess up is, I never remember his last name, but M. Night whatever his last name is. My apologies, everyone.
Shyamalan, I think.
If that's not it, it's certainly close. But so the original movie that he hit really big was The Sixth Sense. It was a brilliantly told story. And one of the ways that he had a very clear vision of the story, and every aspect of it, from the soundtrack to the cinematography to the acting to the dialogue, every aspect, it was an incredibly cohesive movie because all of the storytelling was reinforcing this major theme. And so one of the massive visual rules was that the color red was always prominent on screen during a supernatural occurrence. For instance, when Bruce Willis was there, or things of that sort. This has been done in other movies too. And then there could have been directorial things like, maybe you'll never show, I don't remember if he did this or not, maybe never actually show Bruce Willis and one of the living characters on camera at the same time, like you're always cutting from one to the other, to create this sort of subliminal separation of the two worlds. Right. That's the kind of thing, these rules that you create, that's like a style guide. Having this vision, what things can I play with? How can I alter reality in a sense that is going to help reinforce the overall message or theme of a movie? So you've got a story usually for a video game, but especially movies. You've got a story, and then the visual style guide should in some way be a metaphor for that story. Just like we were talking about with the Shire and contrasting it with Mordor, but also contrasting it with the social attitude of the hobbits in general and stuff like that. So, so that did, this is another just complete sudden segue, but that did remind me of this idea of your whole goal is communication. It is not your job as a 2D artist to just go, well, it looks like the photo or a photo reference or a group of photo references, so my job is done. The critical skill that will separate a great artist from a mediocre artist is learning what details to leave out completely, to minimize, to leave as is, or to exaggerate to any degree of severity, specifically because the artist knows by doing so, they're communicating much better what needs to be communicated, either for the story or, in the case of video games, most often, to make it incredibly clear to the player what's solid, what's not, what can you interact with versus what you can't, what is just there to sort of set the mood and the atmosphere in the world versus what is there letting you know, if you land on me, you'll die or you'll get hit. If you touch me, you'll get a health regeneration. I'm either a bonus object or a poison that shouldn't be touched, or all of these things, right?
Yes, and this is a skill that also ties into your time management because you want to know, any semi-important prop you make for an environment, for example, should be important and have some sort of meaning there. Now, granted, you're still going to be making the mundane things, right? You're going to be making the bushes and the rocks and things that seem like they're not important. Right. But the whole idea is that each of those elements is feeding into these sort of... There's almost a story being told with an environment that is kind of unsaid, right? Like you want to, it's not always just about conveying mood and feeling. Sometimes it's like you want to set up a scene on purpose. Like maybe you want to hint that there are lumberjacks in the next scene. Right. So you've got a stump there with an axe in it, right? You have a visual cue. Keeping in mind the assets you make and how important they are is going to help you manage your time better, because you don't want to spend... I've seen a lot of artists that are getting into games that they spend loads of time toiling away over minor variations within an environment. They might make a tile set that has a million tiles in it, and most of it is very similar to one another. And it's like, okay, if you're not going to make these things wildly different or distinct or meaningful in their own ways, you might as well not even have that distinction.
That is that is the biggest challenge that most beginner artists, or I shouldn't say most entry level video game artists, they got that good that early in life, typically, in their very late teens, early 20s, very often, to become hired for a mainstream studio. A big part of why they got that to that point was ego, right?
Right.
So they saw themselves as an artist. They challenged themselves to become better than most of the people around them at these things, to learn this information, to learn these skills. And they've got a lot. It's very personal for them how well they do something. Every work of art they create, they want to be able to one-up the other artists and say, look how amazing. I was tasked to make this background bush for this landscape. And I'll be damned if it's not going to be the most amazingly impressive bush you've ever seen in your life. It's going to be like really detailed and really stylized. That is such a massive mistake. And ironically, they're kind of embarrassing themselves without knowing it, right? They're showing their kind of naivete and their innocence in spending all this time and energy and wasting an immense amount of other people's money, the people that hired them, on their ego instead of creating what's best for the game, which is more art that isn't. So that's the thing. I've seen this so many times where an art director has to sort of rein in these young, very ego-driven artists and say, look, every aspect of art in a game, it's not about how amazing it looks on its own on your screen on Photoshop. It's about how well it all works cohesively together. And you made an amazing bush, but you made an amazingly attention-getting bush. This bush is to set a mood. This bush was supposed to be part of a very calm, serene, forest setting before the shit hits the fan, so to speak, and the bad guys appear and everything's on fire. You know what I mean? Like, this is supposed to be an object that is supposed to be pleasant out of your peripheral vision, but never draw your attention. And you made it like it's the start of the game. Like, you spent the time like it's the start of the game, and you've tried really hard to make it as attention-getting as possible, which is all the exact opposite of what you should have been doing. And I've seen this firsthand so many times, where someone will literally, for a background object, for all intents and purposes, disposable object that should be done competently, it should do its job, it should be pleasant, it should set the mood, but it should not take a long time to make, and it should not be distracting. Especially if it's not something that the player can interact with. Right. So, and that's the thing. And this is especially important, you're not penalizing the other people that hired you if you're an indie developer and you're making your own game, but you are wasting an incredible amount of your own time, and you're making your project take 10 times longer. If you take every new art asset you need to make, and you treat it like that with your ego in it, and you say, this is going to be the best flower ever, it's way better to get your game working with temp art and to just slowly refine each thing to the point where it gets where it needs to be to look best in its role on the overall screen. Is it the proper contrast? Does it look like, if it's a flower or a bush, it should look like it's not something you interact with. It should just beautifully in your peripheral vision blend into the sort of background. It should help express that overall mood that is supposed to be expressed in this part of the game. And obviously things that you can interact with, like I said, if something is like a spike or thorns that if you touch you get hurt, that's when you need the really sharp contrast, the really jagged lines. You might need to do an occasional animate so the spike shines to just really make it incredibly clear to the player this is a thing you can interact with, and because of the jagged lines and stuff like that, the jagged shapes, this is not something you want to touch. Whereas a health pickup or something like that will tend to be in the cool colors, smoother shapes, gentle movement, things like that. So it sounded like you had something you wanted to say?
Yeah, and I was going to say, just linking back to that a little bit, it's like the objects, if you, and I do a lot of environment art, so like I think of these things a lot. Yeah. The things that you do want to spend the most time on, that you really want to put your energy into, are those important things.
Right.
Like if there is you mentioned interactive object, but to take that a step further, things that are vastly important to the game, like a checkpoint point in a level or the end of the level. You know, the decorative elements that you're going to use for that, whatever they are, that's where you want to spend your time and energy, because that's what's going to make the most impact. You know, things, the mundane objects, you may be tempted to toil away at them, but you know, and I would encourage anyone working on environments, work on these things together in the same composition.
Exactly. A layered...
You want to see them together. You don't want to work on them in isolation.
Exactly.
You're going to make too many mistakes and waste too much time that way.
All right. You're just going to make very bad decisions based on... like if you're working on a bush for an environment, at least have a rough version of that environment as a back layer behind it so that you can work on your bush and see it in what is probably going to be something close to the final colors of the overall environment and everything. Otherwise, you're just going to be making bad decisions for color use, contrast, lighting, and just how attention-getting that particular bush should be. And a metaphor popped into my head. It's kind of like an artist that is given the task of making a bush for an environment. It's exactly the same as a new, really enthusiastic and ego-based background singer, a backup singer. They're supposed to sing in a chorus to blend in with the chorus and to back up the main singer, the star singer, right?
Right.
But imagine they have the ego and they're like, I'm going to show them up and I'm going to sing louder and better than the rest of the chorus and the other singer. They're going to destroy the entire song, right? Because of their ego. They're just going to create this harsh, unwanted contrast, and they're going to make the listeners lose focus on what's supposed to be important. So, and it really is. It's nowhere in no visual art form is it more important than video games, because now the communication isn't just about whether or not something is pretty or what exact mood it conveys, but literally you could be confusing or distracting the player, which is the exact opposite of what your task is as a visual artist for video games. All right, so to segue back to something that we started with, which was depth, just because I had put this other image, that's a sneak of what's to come. But so this is another painting I had done fairly recently in acrylic. And just to get back to that idea of depth, and this, I just wanted to quickly show a non-daytime scene. But if you see, it's the same exact idea. If I literally got this wet paint of this bright pinkish color and mixed it with this blue color and got the average color of the sky, then by mixing that into... So I just wanted to show you that that same principle works in every case. I did want to point out also, I had hinted at this to beginning, and we covered this topic as a concept, but making that decision and veering away from, you're always compensating for a lack of sensory data. So in the real world, you've got a stereoscopic vision to help increase the sense of depth. You've got the openness of the air and the sense. You feel that you're out there in the world and that there's miles around you, that there's not a ceiling and walls. You've got every sense of your body, senses of smell, the feeling of air hitting your skin. Every sense in your body is telling you about the environment you're in, about the actual depth of things. And a lot of that disappears when you're looking at a single, frozen in time, flattened image. So even though a camera is incredibly accurately capturing what it can, which is the reflected light onto this surface that records it, this printed photograph, or the photograph on a computer screen or whatever, you don't get any of that other sensory data. And what a good artist does is he or she compensates for that missing data. Because it is missing. It's missing information. It's missing sense. So, in other words, and I touched on this on another video, if you want to create the illusion in a single image of not a frozen in time moment, but an actual sense of movement, an actual sense of time passing and a person moving in time and walking or running, then the more off-kilter the angle, the more the person is off balance, obviously, so that if they tried to stand still that way, they'd fall right over. Those are all the keys, how you compensate for the missing information of actual movement, and you create the illusion of movement on a single image. You create the illusion of time passing in a single frozen frame of time. So this is critically important, and obviously in a video game you can have movement, you can have parallax scrolling to help emphasize the depth, but it's a critically important skill to learn as a visual artist to be able to learn how to compensate and exaggerate things. So just as an example, usually the paintings I do are from photos that I took, but in the case of this painting and the recent one I did of Tahiti, which is actually behind me, I've never been to Tahiti, so I just did an image search and grabbed like 5 different photos as reference and literally in Photoshop just ripped them apart, scaled them, tweaked their contrast and color balance, and made it into a single cohesive landscape image, or seascape image in this case, I guess, to use as a reference to paint from. But when I'm using a photographic reference, it's now losing all that other sensory data that gives you that sense of depth. So I always exaggerate the rules I know about depth. I always push things further back. You'll see in so many, the actual photographs that I used as reference, the mountains weren't quite as pushed back with the sky color. You know what I mean?
Right, right.
So that may have been more photorealistic, but the problem is the photo itself does not create that same sense of just vastness and openness and just how big those mountains are. It's kind of getting flattened a little, not because the colors or contrast are inaccurate compared to what the human eye would see, but now you don't have what your skin feels and what your ears sense and what your nose senses, and you know what I mean? All of that other sensory data is gone. And so it's important, now that you only have the eyes of the viewer to rely on, you have to exaggerate those things to get back to a more realistic sense. Ironically, the photo, even though it's photorealistic, even though it's exact visual data, because it's not compensating for the visual data, it can actually often be a far less accurate communicator of the feeling of being in that place, of the feeling of vastness and stuff like that, which is often very important in a video game. You really want to emphasize the distance in space or the scale of a castle you're going towards or something like that. So you need to learn as an artist how these rules work so that you can break them and exaggerate to communicate these things. So aside from that, I already touched on this idea of learning what to leave out, and we briefly touched on abstract art and how even then, by far the best abstract artists are going to be the ones that learned what the rules are, or the ways of communicating that are nearly universal, even if subconscious in most people, and you learn how to exaggerate and to break these rules to communicate something, even with abstract shapes on a canvas or something. You're still using these things that you've learned as a communicator, which is the whole job of an artist. But anyway, so we touched on abstract, and I wanted to talk on that thing in the middle, which should be considered the sweet spot, or the most critical fine art school that aspiring game artists should look into, is impressionistic art. Because in a sense, even realistic artists, we're always doing that. No painter ever, no matter how photorealistic, has ever literally captured every detail of what they're doing.
Right. Yeah.
Like, no painter has ever literally gotten out a microscope and painted every last hair follicle on the portrait of a person that they've come close, some of them, the crazy people, but it's never been done, nor would it make sense to spend the time doing so, especially if you're working on a whole video game. So the point is, you're always making judgment calls as an artist of how deep into detail you want to go. And learning how to intentionally reduce detail, leave out things, and then exaggerate the things that are important are going to make you a drastically better storyteller and communicator as a visual artist. And because we were going to be talking about this topic, we got together some of the best examples of my all-time favorite Impressionist artist, whose name was John Singer Sargent. And it is, to me, a tragedy to all great art everywhere in art history that everyone who's an aspiring artist of any kind doesn't know him by name. An absolutely brilliant artist, and he's the perfect example. To me, he is the pinnacle of what Impressionist art should have been, or should have stayed, because he had the sort of street cred. He proved himself doing years or decades of incredibly rigorous study of doing very classical realist, representational, very high detailed art. When he left out details, it was very intentional. When he made a representational, impressionistic painting of a portrait of someone and there's chairs or other things in the background, the fact that he represented those things in the background with a handful of brushstrokes was not because he was lazy. It's not because it was quote unquote his style. It's because he made himself so powerful as an artist with his decades of practice and study that he could do it.
Right. Yeah.
There's a big difference there. Yep. Go ahead.
So what do these photos here have to do with that? I mean,
that's the thing. Yeah, no, that's a great point. Is these look, when they're small thumbnails, a lot of these can look like a photo, and that's the whole point. And I had the pleasure in Boston. They had a John Singer Sargent exhibition. That's the word, right?
Yeah.
And I got to see what a finally most of these paintings, like these portraits. I'll just load one up now. It's massive. This one actually is tiny, but most of them are really big. And if you stand at it from several yards away, it looks more realistic than a photograph. Hyper real. You could see from this little portrait here, it's not the details that make this so enthralling and real. And it's not just like, oh wow, that looks like a photo. It's like, holy crap, that guy is about to stand up and confront me. Right. That guy's eyes, his posture, the way he's sitting in his chair, like he's practically about to get out of it and walk towards you. That's also called contrapposto, which was mastered by long before Sargent in the Renaissance Italy. It's the whole idea of intentionally twisting the torso or the neck and the limbs to create this sense of movement, to create the sense of life in someone that's otherwise, quote unquote, just sitting there. So the engagement, the furrowed brow, the focus of this guy's pupils, you could see there's a level of sort of pursing to his mouth, and the way the mustache and the lines of the cheeks, everything accentuates the fact that he's in the middle of an intense expression. Mm-hmm. This is more of a frozen moment in time than any photograph could ever be, because it compensates for that missing sensory data in a way that no photograph ever could. Unless it was heavily manipulated by an artist. You could have
someone sort of performing this general action and get it on video, but you're never going to get a single frame
image
that is as perfectly crafted as this pose.
And it's just impactful. It communicates so many things. And this is a mantra I'm going to repeat in so many videos in the future. The most critical thing to keep in mind as an artist to make powerful art, to make your art better faster, is always be telling a story.
Right.
And John Singer Sargent, he almost never just painted a thing. He was always conveying a story. He was taking a large moment in time and doing a masterful job of encapsulating and exaggerating all of it in a single image. And it literally, so many of his images, including this one, can just make the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. It's just so communicative. It's so expressive.
And even just if you look how his stretched out leg there, with the one he's kind of like putting out there to get up with, it goes clear to the bottom of the image. Right. And it leads your eyes straight up with the line created by his shirt there, straight to his face. Right. The fact, now, if that foot had been maybe a little in a different spot, or his knee was bent, and it was like his foot was to one side and the leg wasn't so straight like that, it wouldn't achieve that as well. Right. It was deliberately put that. You see what I'm saying?
And again, this goes to what to leave out, not just the placement and layout, but what to leave out. Look at the brilliance. Look how the face is very detailed for an impressionist art. But you've got this circle that it's like the fuzzy brush in Photoshop. It puts a solid color in the center and it just gets more and more blurry as it goes out. You've got the same thing. And this makes it impossible for the viewer to focus on the wrong thing. Literally everything else is out of focus, and it all is a circle, a target going to this person's face. It's so brilliantly done. And another thing, I, as a really fanatical figure artist that really cares about creating the illusion of the proper form of the thing in space and foreshortening, if I had done this painting, I would have been so incredibly tempted to hit a brighter highlight on this knee so that you don't end up with a more amorphous shape. Really delineate. There's a plane that's very much almost flat, like a tabletop surface of this thigh. And then there's where the knee should transition to this very sharp change in angle, because now you've got the lower leg going downward. And I would have been so tempted to hit a stronger highlight at that edge there and in the knee and sort of taper it to really create that image. But that would have been very distracting from the focal point.
Exactly.
You know what I mean? So now you've got this leg, which seems hyper real when you just look at the thing in general, especially from yards back. And remember, this is a very small painting, this particular one. You could see how it's just like one or two blurry brushstrokes for each of these details in the carpeting here. You know, the wall again, it's just like thrown in. You could see how big each particular brush bristle was. This, you know, when he was knocking in this background, it's just these perfectly placed highlights on this middle tone color to establish the form. You know, like you get the feeling that this is a detailed tablecloth, but when you look at the actual details, it's like a handful of swirly, wrist-flicking brushstrokes with a fairly primary colors into a still wet. He worked in oils predominantly when he worked on these larger or more detailed things, but we're going to see some of his watercolor sketches, which are equally impressive. But anyway, the whole point is knowing what you can leave out, what you should leave out, how things should be intentionally out of focus when that's appropriate. Just telling that story. Like that, catching that highlight not only conveys to you that that is a hard, shiny, smooth metal object, but you get a little more detail about this character. Like that's his ring finger. He's a married man. You know what I mean? That's a gold ring.
Yep.
That
so
hand.
Simple, and it tells the story. Just that.
It just,
little spot on his
finger,
finger,
it's like it makes all of us a bit of a Sherlock Holmes, even if it's happening subconsciously. Everything that's not like just a single brushstroke, it's telling you part of the story. It's setting this mood, and it's just
and
so
and it's
done.
sort of like how he's got the one hand on the book, as though that's what he was doing. He was reading that book. But he's closed it. See how his fingers
He's keeping the page
in the middle.
He's keeping the page.
And then his other hand looks far more agitated. Like if you look at he's
tightly clawing
the chair,
right?
As like not just because he's getting up, but it gives you the feeling of uneasiness,
right?
You know, like he's been disturbed.
Always be telling a story. Right? So this is what he was doing. He was calm. He was reading. He's now engaged in a conversation that is clearly very relevant to him, and he wants it to be relevant to you. You now have his full attention. So again, a single moment in time, but you know what he was doing. You know how he transitioned out of what he was doing by keeping the page and closing the book, and you can literally follow time. From here, you can literally follow time into the imbalance. So you have a static book on a table that's closed, but the pages are kept this amazingly undetailed but incredibly hyper photorealistic hand, despite the fact that it's a few brushstrokes for the highlights on a middle tone and a few shadows. It feels so real when you stand a few yards back. The same thing with that ring. It's a couple of brushstrokes, but you literally follow time as you spiral out of a closed book. It's telling you that he kept the page. He's married. Subconsciously, you're learning this. Oh, what's this? His body is leaning away from the book. He's moved away from what he was doing, and now he's in an agitated state. By the leaning of the torso, you could tell that he's in an agitated state. By the placement of his feet, the extreme perspective, right? You've got the foot representing where he was in the past of calmly sitting, and you've got this leg that he's recently brought forward to come toward you that's literally pointing toward the viewer, right? Like everything about this is such incredibly brilliant storytelling. So, and then you can follow that spiral right down to the hand clutching the arm of the chair, which not only represents agitation, but also physical movement and something so critical, which is sort of anticipation. He's clutching because he's getting a grip because he's likely going to stand up. Or at least that's the threat. And not necessarily that he's going to start a fight, but there is a sword back there at the ready. That's not an accident. All of these things convey very specific emotions and potentials and the past. One tiny little image with just masterful brushstrokes, masterful storytelling. But if you look at any one thing, it is made out of a relative handful of brushstrokes, lacking an immense amount of detail. Look at that hair, which looks so hyper-realistic if you look at it from a distance. It's got like 2 highlight colors, a mid-tone, and I mean, it's so few brushstrokes relative to the insane level of realism that it evokes in the viewer. Like, look at the tassels on the end of the so few brushstrokes, choosing the perfect color, the perfect value, and the perfect brushstroke to convey all of that information and to create a hyper-real and exaggerated sense of everything that was relevant to this story. This is just a portrait of a dude sitting in a chair.
Yep.
So
yeah, it seems like it's so simple in terms of the elements in the scene, but so much is conveyed. Yeah. It's amazing.
So, excuse me. So everyone, if this is interesting to you, if you want to become better as an artist, we're only going to cover a handful. I want to keep this video pretty short, but this is achieving a level of brilliance that can only come from years and years of dedication to learning how things work and learning the rules so that you can intentionally bend or break those rules. So here is an insanely quick, rough, small, just capturing of a person's likeness and their mood and personality in the moment. You can see how few brushstrokes and how few colors he used, and just relying on the blending of the oils as he laid on these colors. This reminds me a lot of modern, the best concept artists out there these days. They were clearly influenced by this or followed the same path, so they arrived at the same expressiveness and ability to capture and evoke so much of a sense of 3D form and lighting and anatomy and personality in such a, making it seem effortless. All the effort came the decades before of hard work to get to this skill level.
Right.
So just really brilliant stuff. So I mean, look at these eyes. They feel so alive and so photorealistic. They don't even have strung catch lights in them. But look at look how he's looking off to the side and everything. You get such an incredible sense of presence and personality, and you feel like you could recognize this guy on the street if you saw him again, even though there's actually so little information of his exact features given here.
Right, yeah.
But anyway, so, and here I think is one of his watercolors. Yeah. So again, this looks nearly photorealistic as a thumbnail. You can see just his brilliant use, like leaving so much of the white paper, this contrast of shape, this use of careful perspective to create the sense of depth. Even though it's off center, you feel like you are the person there and you're walking toward, and you're going to be walking into that doorway. And it's darkened and it's mystery, but there's light on the other side, and there's just everything. There's so little detail. And my apologies, everyone. This is a fairly low-res and blurry image, so we can't really appreciate every last little brushstroke or anything, but you could just see the extent. This is an artist that knows what is important to spend a little time on, to add a little more contrast, to make sure the colors are a little more vivid and things like that. You can see the intense level of blues in the shadows. I mentioned this in another video. Da Vinci said look for blue in all shadows. A shadow is inherently more cool. The warm colors get faded away. Sunlight is represented with yellows or orange tints to the highlight colors. So in general, if you really want to emphasize, ironically, just like I said, if you want a red thing to look as red as possible, you put it near a strong green. If you want something to feel especially warm, like a hot summer day, having the blue shadows contrast the extreme general warm midtones and especially highlights is going to give you that ability. And just as a side note, one of those people I told you about they became a student of mine for actual traditional landscape oil painting and acrylic painting. He was telling me he was working on a painting of a sunset, and he could not get the sun bright enough. He put so many layers of pure white paint on, it was bothering him. The sun just wasn't bright enough, and it was driving him crazy. He said, can I bring the painting and get what is there a special tube of paint? What can I do to really get the sun to look bright? And I said, ironically, your painting doesn't look bright enough because it's not dark enough. So the reason his sun didn't look as bright as possible, and actually, yeah, unfortunately I don't have It's behind me on the wall, but there's the same thing. There's a sunset with a bright white sun back there. And if you look at the little corner, you can't see this right now, Corey, but the whole point is the area around a sunset where it looks like a pale yellow, and then you have the white sun inside of that, it's actually a lot darker than you think. So a lot of artists, they will paint that color very pale because, like, of course it's pale. It's right near the sun and it looks yellow to me. So they'll paint it yellow. But then when they paint the white sky, remember, paint can only reflect light. It doesn't emit light. So even pure white paint is far less bright than something like the sun that literally emits light. Mm-hmm. So again, it's compensating for this what can't be done with 2D media. So in order for the whiteness of the sun, the brightness of the sun, to look as bright as it does in the real world with your real human eyes, you have to compensate for the fact that now you're only using reflected light instead of emitted light. And I'm saying emitted, not omitted. So he brought in his painting and I showed him. We darkened the colors around the sun and we darkened the shadows on the opposite side of things that were lit by the sun. And suddenly his painting came to life. And suddenly every light color on there seemed twice as vivid and twice as light, like it was emitting color. Because we were compensating for that fact that paint doesn't emit light. But anyway, so let me get back into the Sargent folder. Let's see. Oh, this one, you know how I feel about it. We had a long discussion about... oh, no, it's not this one. Hold on. It's in this folder somewhere. Oh, those alligators are amazing. Look at this. So few brushstrokes and textures and colors. Such a sense. You've got these graceful, natural S-curves over and over again. You've got the contrast of the sunlit areas where detail is washed out and you only have the most extreme shadows captured by the planes opposite the surfaces that are catching the light. Just capturing the sense of wetness and reflection on sand or dirt with this shallow water. The fact that this crocodile's mouth is open and his teeth are catching an unnatural amount of light. Like he's in that much shadow. His teeth shouldn't be catching that much light. But you know what I mean? It kind of makes sense to emphasize the crocodile's teeth when he has an open mouth. So all of these sort of things, just casting these shadows across the back of them, having this contrast of light and dark just makes an amazing difference. And then you can see how kind of simplified and abstracted the background becomes in the far distance. And the bushes here that are less relevant are less detailed. And then as you get closer and closer to the faces of these, I'm forgetting, are those alligators or...
I think these are crocs.
Okay.
And the alligators
yeah,
are
I could have it backwards.
Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
All right, so let's quickly get into the other... this is the one that I absolutely love.
Yeah.
This is another one that is a relatively small sketch. So again, it's just about storytelling and how much is conveyed with so few brushstrokes and how everything is relevant. Everything that's left in, like obviously if things were completely gone, like this building in the background, we would lose a small sense of claustrophobia. We would lose a small sense of the fact that this is an entire village or town, that there's a reason that this woman is walking down this street. We get from point A to point B. All of that would be missing if he didn't at least capture those background buildings and stuff like that. But he knew it was a relatively not relevant aspect of the story, so it didn't need a lot of its own specific details. Mm-hmm. And so as you get closer, you get a little more detail with the buildings, which are obviously way less important than the people in the scene. But it sets the stage, so to speak, for this story to be told, this moment in time. And it's just so beautiful. There's this somberness to the woman. She's alone, she's isolated, she's trying to get where she needs to go. You have this dress that's literally scraping the ground. You can tell she's a woman that does not want attention.
Right.
You get that sense from her, right? She almost feels like a widow, and that's increased by this seemingly black coat or shawl or whatever that she's wearing. She just has a somber look on her face. She looks like she's sort of looking off to the side. She seems almost lost in memory. Even her lipstick looks almost brown, like dark. She looks like she's frowning. And then she's wearing this very long dress that covers her whole body. And you get that massive highlight capturing that sense of motion and flair at the bottom with the step of her foot. So you really feel that she's moving, but she's sort of subdued. You get the sense she almost wants to be a ghost. And here you have her quietly walking by. You've got in the distance, and again, remember, you can literally go back in time. You could tell she was coming from back there, and she's here now, and she's going to be passing you as a ghost viewer soon, or as a sort of a viewer without a body witnessing this moment in time. But it doesn't feel like a single snapshot. It feels like you're in the moment. And the lighting and everything captures, the lighting captures the sense that you're in this kind of side street it's kind of overcast. You're a little bit in shadow, even though you could tell it's daytime, especially by the really bright highlight hit here by the sun making it through between some buildings. And then you've got this group here, so she's not completely isolated. You don't have a sense that she's in danger. You just get the sense that she wants to be alone. She's in her own thoughts. She's very much, you could see by the way she's holding her two hands together, kind of protecting herself in a sense, this kind of modesty. All of this is conveyed. The body language doesn't just convey movement, it conveys the opposite of flamboyant movement, and this tucked in, kind of isolated, this desire to not be seen. So then you have this group back here who are now completely oblivious to her, and perhaps always were, because these two people are obviously wrapped up in their own interaction. And this guy back here is just a few blobs. But there's such a sense of liveliness and motion. And you could see this woman sitting here attentively listening or engaging in a conversation back there. And so then you get to these guys here, which is just fascinating. They're very intentionally nearly silhouettes, and they're standing still. But there's this sense of livelihood and motion, one leaning on a wall, the other placing all of his weight on the one leg. And it looks like he's got like a pipe in his hand or something that he's paying some level of maintenance to. You can see his thumb there over it. Everything, like there's so few brushstrokes and such a short range of dark colors, minus obviously the slightly stronger highlights on the face, which was a critical part of the storytelling. So, and the same thing with the hand. It just further increases the story that's being told. He's not just smoking his pipe right now. It's not sticking out of his mouth because he's engaged in conversation. He's more engaged in the conversation with the other man than he is with smoking the pipe. Yet at the same time, and he's like leaning into what should be the field of view of the other man, who has stopped paying attention to the person he's conversed with to witness and to watch this woman walk by. So you've got just these few brushstrokes and these few shapes and these very low detailed things, not just capturing this second in time, but capturing perhaps several minutes in time. And the mood, and the temperature, and the social climate. All of these things are being conveyed in a way that no photograph ever could, with infinitely less detail, but the details that are there are carefully changed and exaggerated or downplayed. Colors are brought up, colors are subdued. Highlights that would be there in reality are removed so that it's less distracting. All of these sort of decisions that are made. This is real representational art when it is mastered. This is being a communicator.
And I think what, just to add a bit, what speaks to that is you see so much modern art that is so extreme and in your face, and like, you know what I mean? Hyper exaggerated, which is fine if that's what you want to go for, but the reason this is the mastery is all of the detail that's conveyed in this story so subtly. There's nothing extreme about this scene. You see what I'm saying?
Even the things that were exaggerated, it was to create a sense more real than a photo would. Once you get hyper exaggerated, especially, and it's unfortunate, but a huge amount of modern artists, and especially abstracted or impressionist artists these days and for the last several decades, they hid behind it. They relied on it as a sort of cop-out to not spend the decades to master the craft and to master the information so that they know how and why they're breaking rules of everything from perspective and lighting to especially anatomy and proportion. And the fact is that when you exaggerate something for a style because you think it's marketable or you just think it looks cool, does not mean that you're able to evoke the same level. Let's face it, the more and more something looks and feels less and less and less like a real thing and like a human face, if it's supposed to be a human and a human being, the less and less natural empathy will be triggered. Right? So there's a giant amount of our brains evolved to see a real human face and the nuances of real human expression to communicate and convey emotion and to make us empathize, sympathize, and all of these other things. And the more abstracted, the more changed, the more those things are missing or hyper exaggerated, We might get what is being said, but it's no longer a real thing to us. It can never convey. It can never be as impactful as something that's still that hasn't left that uncanny valley, so to speak, right?
Right.
Once it's so abstracted, you can't possibly empathize with it. You can't, not even for a second do you go and you're like, is your kind of lizard brain or your animal brain going to go, that's a real thing. That thing has emotions. Mm-hmm. The core subliminal reaction that you have to an image, it can't happen, or the more and more you abstract to those extremes, the less that can happen. Obviously, to the point where you get so abstracted that you're not even representing real or tangible or physical 3D things in a 3D world anymore, at which point all you have left is, these are jagged lines, these, you know, these colors contrast in this way or that way, these are cool colors, that's all great, but you're now incredibly limited with what you can communicate successfully and accurately to other people. Right? Now you can evoke very specific things, but you're not going to tell an incredibly enthralling and accurate moment in time spanning several minutes with a bunch of spilled paint on a canvas.
And it speaks, like with this image, how long can you look at this image and how much can you get out of it by looking at it? You know, you see a lot of art these days that is, you know, you want to see it at a glance, but you don't want to look at it longer than a glance.
Right, exactly.
And why is that? Why is that? What's missing from it? Is it telling a story, or is it just a thing?
Exactly. And that's, what I mean? And that's the masterful thing about a master storyteller. They've learned what to leave out, what to exaggerate, how to draw your attention. And even though all these little nuances that we discussed, they might not immediately jump out at you, the overall feeling is there, even for a non-like artsy-fartsy art student. Like I just learned all this stuff. I never went to art school. I just looked at these things while I was learning and was drawn to artists that I could tell were just making really impactful, really amazing art. And I just looked at them and thought about them. So you don't have to be this is all sort of human nature, stuff we evolved to experience, and learning about that and learning how to monopolize it and just like gain control of those normal human reactions and how to communicate to trigger those reactions in people is what a real master of art does. So there are many artists that get really good at rendering and really good at doing those super fine details, and they'll spend like years doing a single painting that is insanely photographic in that sense. But very often, and typically with artists like that, their stuff will feel completely dead. They'll draw a person that looks amazingly well rendered and really cool, but just no personality, no expression. I think we've all seen that a million times.
Yeah,
you know
it's
what I'm
sort of
talking
like
about.
it's sort of like the difference if you wanted to leap back into the world of game art. It's like, okay, are you someone who creates models? Are you a modeler? You know, in the industry, you would have that job. You would model things. But you're going to be completely different from the person who's taking that model and not only texturing it and adding color, but also the person who's going to render it. How are you going to render it? Rendering a scene in 3D, getting the camera placement perfect, it's sort of like...
That's the storytelling. Right.
That's the storytelling. That's a totally different skill set.
And then, of course,
the person who's adding all the detail to the model.
And then, of course, when it comes to the character design for the model in the first place, very often a concept artist, it might not be the same artist. Usually in a big AAA 3D game, it is not. A concept artist will have designed 2D images of this character, and then it would be given to a 3D artist to make a model based on that. So a really good concept artist, they're always going to be thinking in the back of their head, who is this character? What is their personality? What is their history? And they're going to use these sort of ideas, even if it never leaves their head, even if they never tell the rest of the team. Their character design is drastically better because they're telling a story.
Exactly.
But anyway, so I'm going to need to cut the video short. I could go on forever about this, but that's why this will almost certainly end up a series. But you could see, imagine a photorealistic illustration of this face. Imagine how hard it would be to convey the fact that she's walked past, they were communicating, and she now has his attention. The slight tilt of his head, the slight furrow of the brow, the way somehow we can tell in such few brushstrokes that he is definitely looking directly at her is breathtaking. And someone could spend literally a year doing a hyper photorealistic painting with every hair follicle of this face and not capture at all the same amount of storytelling and not convey as clearly and accurately the same level of detail of the story, not of the image, not of the follicles, but the story. The story doesn't necessarily need a million brushstrokes and a million hair follicles. It needs you to know what is relevant and what is not, and how to leave out things that are distracting and exaggerate things that are the relevant things. And anyway, this goes directly, I'm going to end it this way to bring it back into pixel art. When you're doing pixel art, when you have limited frames, when you have obviously very limited detail, and in real pixel art, you're always dealing with a limited number of colors at your disposal, usually for a character. In a 16-bit game, you're talking about 16 colors, or 15 and a clear color, or in 8-bit games, you're often talking about 3 colors.
Right.
All the more important that you think about how to convey what's relevant in the character in that pose, in that animation that might only have 2 frames or 3 frames, how to convey that story as beautifully and expressively and as accurately as possible to make the game look good and communicate what it needs to. And looking at and thinking about and studying the true masters and geniuses like John Singer Sargent will help you. And it's, again, it goes to contrast of color. We have this extreme contrast of her black coat type thing with the kind of satiny white gown she's wearing. All of these decisions to make, like I'll say all the time with sprite design of a character, you always want the limbs to really show well against the torso and the rest of the body. You want really clear, for the sake of communication, you want really clear silhouette, the overall outline of the body. Even if all the detail were erased, you want to be able to tell what pose the character's in. So as much as possible, you want the limbs away from the torso so they're not overlapping that much. So you can say, oh, I'm about to throw a punch, and one fist is way back and the other arm is forward and the torso's leaning back away from the eventual direction of the punch. All of those things, you want that contrast of color, contrast of value, and to some degree, even with pixel art, contrast of texture. Do you want something to look like a feathery cloak hood versus smooth metal versus whatever? And always think, how can I separate these body parts? You don't want what I call the confetti effect, where there's so many details everywhere and so everything is so high detailed, you lose track of what is the overall form. You want the opposite. You want, okay, I can see the arms really clearly, distinct from the torso, distinct from the legs, and then you can really, that way when you animate and you pose your character, you're able to communicate incredibly clearly what the pose is, what the movement is. And so I'm going to force any last thoughts before we end this video for now?
Yeah, just a simple one.
Yep.
For this image,
Yep.
like what you mentioned about red, what is the
Yep.
prominent color surrounding her face there?
Yep.
On most sides? The
Yep.
color of her undershirt there.
Yep.
That's the only distinct red used in the whole scene.
Yep.
And it's there just to draw your eye to that
Yep.
spot.
Flat,
First thing you see.
most of them here surrounding her somber face and that critical expression. She's the star, even though she's not perfectly centered in the image. And then you have the vanishing points, the most obvious vanishing points pointing to her. And then you've got these big splashes of red color. But then you have, look, you've got this reddish color in between this conversation. And then you've got this splash of brightly lit pink in the central point of this little group back here in this conversation. It's just, everything about this is just brilliant storytelling as an artist. Obviously, you should build your skills of anatomy and perspective and learn how armor works if you're going to be a video game artist and all these things, robotic. But you should be studying things like these kinds of storytelling, these decisions of what to leave out and what to exaggerate. This frame of mind and these thoughts are what separate brilliant art of any kind, brilliant 2D art and 3D art for the most part, okay or acceptable or even professional, but not brilliant.
Right.
But anyway, so we'll just really quickly go through the other, but I'm not even going to say anything, but just really quickly show everyone all of these images to hopefully entice you to look into Singer Sargent. And there are so many other, I mean, I could speak forever about just the brilliance of creating the illusion of transparent fabric and satin with so few brushstrokes. Just absolutely breathtaking skill. All right, it looks like that's the majority of it. So yeah, just amazing. Just brilliant stuff. We will wrap it up there. Thanks a lot for the great conversation as always, Corey, and I hope this was interesting to people, and I do hope that some people are inspired to look into Singer Sargent and his work. And there will be other videos related to this in the future. Maybe I'll start a playlist for this particular topic. But thanks everyone for watching.